Hi, good morning. This is Mike Morris. I'm the superintendent of schools here in Amherst and Pelham. And with me today is Tim, so I'll let Tim introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Sheehan. I'm the curriculum coordinator for the Amherst Regional Public Schools.
And we want to thank you for coming to today's session. We're going to talk through the elementary remote learning schedule and plan. Our plan today is to talk for about 15-20 minutes, going through some of the basics and some questions we've already received via email, and then open it up for more dialogue. For those of you who are here, if you look at the lower right-hand corner of your screen, there should be an opportunity to make comments. We'll try to go through our presentation, then get to the Q&A. But if people want to try it out just to say hi or good morning or whatever, just so you know how that system works, you can feel free to do that. But really, thank you coming. We're really excited to share our plan. We know it's a little complex, and Tim and I were just talking before we started that we tried to solve some complex problems, and there's no Occam's razor simple solution to them. There's really was the only way to do it was to create a complex schedule to meet our students' needs, and that's what we'll plan to go through today. But really, thank you for joining us, and I'm going to share my screen, so go through a couple slides before we open it up for more interactive dialogue. Okay, there we are. And I think I'm going to take Tim and I off so that people can see the shared images a little bit larger. Yeah, I think that looks better. So again, thanks for being here, and we'll go through these and then go through some questions. So really our guiding frames of how we were approaching this task is last spring, the state set up a dynamic or a directive that we were really providing a menu of academic resources. It was an emergency situation. We know that was very hard for many of our families and frankly for our staff who are more used to providing instruction than resources. This year, it's not the same situation. We are both mandated and excited to be providing explicit instruction for students. We did a survey last spring, which many of you took. We had a great turnout for that, or response rate for that, of families and staff members. And some of the themes that came out is everyone wanted a predictable and reliable set of a schedule and routines throughout the day and the week. There was a large focus on all parties on providing more synchronous instruction, live instruction for students. There was also a feeling, and I think research bears this out, that small group instruction really matters, that we have 20 elementary students in a classroom. That's not the best place for instruction to happen. Even as adults, and Tim and I know, when our leadership team is about 20 people on it, we have meetings and everybody's on it. It ends up being a lot of this right now, a lot of monologue. And that's not how we teach. That's not how we think students learn best. So it's really focusing on small group instruction. We want to provide, some of that feedback was that we wanted to provide more clarity and wayfinding systems so folks could gather resources and know where to go. And also strong relationships between students and staff. Last spring, we had the advantage of having 6 or 7 months where staff and students got to know each other and built a classroom community. That's not our scenario for this year. So we know we need to build in some of that social emotional time. And so that really led to our priorities for our schedule development. A group of staff members met this spring, and here's a summary of the priorities that they developed. Again, you'll see a through line between the survey results and the priorities. And one of the challenges for us is that we are not based in person in having small group instruction. We try to do it as much as we can, but it led to some complications of how to do that in a virtual schedule. How do we provide small group instruction throughout the workday, throughout the school day and the workday for many families? And so that's why things got complex. I've seen some schedules from other states and other districts that are kind of an hour for each of the core subjects, all in a large group. And kind of our the evidence last spring here, but also the research evidence would be that that's not necessarily the best way to approach elementary school virtual education. Our teachers just finished on Tuesday a week of distance learning from a virtual school. International school's been around a long time, and they also reinforced that small group instruction, particularly in the core areas, is critical, and particularly for elementary age students. And so I think I will turn it over to Tim to explain this very complicated chart. We'll look at a grade level specific one in a minute that I think will help illuminate some of the kind of what it looks like on a granular level much clearer. But I'll turn it over to Tim.
Thanks, Mike. So the reason for showing this is to get a sense of what an elementary school schedule on the broad level looks like. So this would be the schedule for the entire school. You can see kindergarten on the far left side and grade 6 on the far right side. And the need to look at a whole school is because there are staff shared across grade levels. So in fact, when students have different subjects is dependent on when other grades have those subjects. You'll note in the right about the middle is a lunch block that's highlighted in blue there. And that was designed so that students who are getting school meals that are delivered out to neighborhoods, that there's enough time for them to get those meals, and for all students to have lunch and to have some time away from the computer screen. And so that is time that won't be supervised by school staff online, but is time for lunch, for recess at home, for other types of play and time away. I also point out on there that you'll see with each grade level, except for kindergarten, you see a 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, and so on. And we'll explain a little bit more as the slides go along, but each class will be split into an A group and a B group. And this goes back to what Mike just mentioned about an effort to create smaller groups for teachers to work with. And just the final note on this slide is kindergarten in the remote setting will be half day. So the kindergarten session prior to that lunch block is the morning session, and the session after the lunch block is the afternoon session. And Mike, I think we can go to the next slide. All right, and this is an example class schedule. So this, we simply took out one grade and blew it up a little bit for better visibility here. And I want to point out on the left side is the A group, and on the right side is the B group. So this is a single class. This is one classroom teacher, but divided into two groups. And so the elementary schools have been doing classroom placement the way that they normally would and placing students into classes. And then teachers will be working to divide their class into the two groups. And you'll see that the subject areas are staggered in a way here so that teachers can be teaching small groups and can alternate between group A and group B. So if I just take a few moments to start at the top, you'll see that all students are together in a morning meeting. And this is a community building time, a check-in time for teachers to give students some information about the day. It's 15 minutes. It's not intended to be long. And again, putting 20 students together at one time on a Google Meet is not as productive as smaller groups. So we really want to use those times well, but also keep them to a minimum. Then you'll see that group A goes into an independent literacy time. And so there will be activities that students will be engaged in. There'll be some choices of online activities. There may be some activities that students will do off the computer at that time, related to literacy skills. After that, staying with group A, they go into a math mini lesson. And this could be taught live or it could be a recording. And the reason it may be a recording, if you look over to group B is in a small group literacy lesson at the same time. And so the classroom teacher will be engaged with group B. So while there may be times that a teacher will do a live mini lesson, more often than not, it will probably be a recorded lesson. Then group A proceeds into their math small group lesson where they now have the teacher with them. And this is, again, a time for smaller group, more intensive support from the teacher. And then that group has a break. And then they have their mini lesson in literacy and their literacy small group. One thing you'll note is that we tried to set up these schedules and so that the mini lessons came before the small group work, and that's so students have a chance to get engaged in some of the work before meeting with the teacher. That's been identified as a strong practice, and that was something that teachers really emphasized that would be helpful in designing the schedule. Then there's the lunch block, and that's the same for both groups. And then if you go to the afternoon, there's a WIN block. And so WIN is an acronym for what I need. And there'll be multiple things happening during this block. Students who receive services from special educators, from occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech and language teachers, that may be occurring during this time. English learner support may be happening. Instrumental music lessons could happen during this time. And at times there may be some independent activities going on during the WIN block. Then Group A moves into specials. And so this is what you're used to: art, music, PE, computers, library. And the specials teachers will be teaching live lessons. And then another break. And then an independent choice time. And most classroom teachers will probably provide like a choice board of activities where students can select from activities. Again, some may be online resources that the district is providing. Some may be offline activities related to their academics of the day. It's been really important to all of us that kids continue to be engaged in project-based learning and completing activities and doing investigations that don't involve computers all day long. And then the final block of the day, in the case of this grade, is social studies or science for the whole class. And again, this will be a live lesson with some possible time where one colleague is using the term catch and release, where a teacher might set some kids off with an activity, send them off to do something, and then come back to the whole group. And that may be used at other times during the day as well. And then it ends with a closing meeting to wrap up the day, to do some final social community building before closing the day out. And you can look down the B side. I won't go through all of that step by step, but you can see that it's mostly staggered so the teacher can bounce back and forth between the groups. Okay, I think we can move on, Mike. Oops.
Sorry about that, Tim. I think you're good.
That's all right. So we put here some frequently asked questions. And some of this I explained a little bit as I went through the schedule, but it may give you a little more detail. And so some questions that have come up as we develop schedules is what happens during an independent literacy block. And again, as I mentioned, that students may be reading independently or engaging in online curriculum and tools to support literacy. And this may be reading actual books that one holds in one's hand, or one of the online resources that delivers ebooks to children. The independent choice block. And so as I mentioned, this may be project-based learning based on the curriculum areas that are happening during the day. It might be some outdoor learning or choices. So teachers could present a menu of activities and students choose which ones they're going to engage in. The math and literacy mini lessons, again, will often be pre-recorded, but may sometimes be a live mini lesson. And this is a mini lesson is exactly what it sounds like. It's meant to be brief. And this is terminology that we use when we're in school normally during a typical school year, where a mini lesson is the launch to an academic block so that students get the big idea. And then teachers usually spend the time after that working with individual students or small groups to help them understand the concept that was taught. And so that would be the small group blocks. Okay. The social studies or science block, students will participate in live instruction for unit study lessons. And social studies and science during a typical school year is often alternated, where teachers will teach a science unit for several weeks, followed by a social studies unit for several weeks. I don't anticipate a change to that sort of structuring. Each grade level and teacher has their own approach to that scheduling. But this will be done in a block during the day, and may also have other parts of the day integrated. So there may be reading and writing involved in science learning or social studies learning. During the specials blocks, students participate in direct instruction in the specials areas. During those morning and closing meetings, this is a time to, again, build routines, to have an opportunity for students and teachers to check in with each other and to make sure that they continue to build community in this remote fashion. During the lunch block, this is not supervised by school staff. So students will have time to have lunch, to have some playtime, time outside, away from the computer, and much like what our lunch and recess block would look like during a normal school day. And then during the WIN block, which is something new on this schedule, the What I Need block is a time for learning extensions, special education services, instrumental music, reading or math intervention, or English learners support, as well as other services that students receive that can be plugged in during the school day. Okay.
And so I'll do a couple more, and I see there's a number of questions coming through the chat, more than probably I could keep up with at the moment. So we have a couple more slides and we'll transition there. So, the A and B groups, as you can see in the schedule that Tim talked about earlier, that this is the way for our schools to get to small group instruction. I want to clarify, because I see some of the comments, that it's not that Pelham won't be doing it, but it is a different model when you have one teacher per grade level. And some of the class sizes in Pelham, like first grade in particular, are incredibly small. So, I think the focus is on small group instruction. Pelham, there are some ways that we can get at that without an A-B model because of the class size in certain grade levels. Other ones, it's a little bit harder. But teachers are putting those together, again, the same way they would do typical placement, looking at friendships as well as looking at service delivery and making sure students have peers. So I think that'll come up more in the questions that we get as well, but I wanted to address that here. During asynchronous learning periods, are students still logged in with the teacher available? So as you saw when Tim was going over the schedule, that teachers are going back and forth, they're toggling between the two groups. So the asynchronous periods, they are working with the other group of students. As we're trying to get small groups, it's sort of the only way we were able to get it with the same number of teachers is to have that model. I think the really important thing that Tim in particular, as well as some of the principals and assistant principals, have talked about is that we've purchased a number of different online learning platforms that students can do independently for families who want their children involved in that. Maybe at the end, Tim, you can talk a little bit about some of the math, literacy, and science programs that are self-directed, that even young students can have success working on, like Lexia, reading, and some of the other ones that we've done. We didn't have those last spring in the same way. So that is a really important difference from last spring to now, is that it's not, we're trying to create situations where it's not totally on the caregiver to be able to provide that. There's a number of questions, and I'm seeing one now about the number of transitions. So in Google Meets, so the idea is that there would not need to be a new Google Meet address for each model. So if there's a mini lesson that transitions to a small group lesson, it'd be in the same kind of Google Meet call. So I think on the schedule, and then we went back and forth on this, we chose to give a much more detailed schedule to families than a lot of the places, again, that are just showing math happens in this hour. But I also want to be really clear that it's not involving the same number of transitions that it looks like on the schedule from the student perspective. We're trying to give a pretty granular amount of information to families to be really transparent about it, but it's not about navigating each of those specific transitions. And I think we always have this tension point. We're trying to simulate as much as possible the kind of instruction students would get during the school day, but in-person instruction requires different things than virtual instruction. So, we sort of had some decisions to make about, do we do instrumental music? Do we do specials? And in our opinion at the district, we value those arts. We value those things, and they create another transition for students. So at the end of the day for us is we wanted to provide more well-rounded virtual education than probably we're able to pull off really last spring. And that does involve more transitions. And we know that's has major implications for caregivers about being able to support particularly young students. One of the things that we'll get to, and it's a great segue, is that there are two platforms. So one of the pieces of feedback we received from last spring from staff in particular is how to not necessarily use Google Classroom for our youngest students. That it's really, the interface it requires reading. We know some of our youngest students aren't quite reading, at that level yet. and it didn't seem developmentally appropriate for many of our students, many of our families, and many of our staff. So we have transitioned to Seesaw, which is a different program that is meant for younger students and provides a lot more ability to navigate regardless of reading skills or age level. So we think that'll be more successful than Google Classroom is for our youngest students. Again, a lot more icons, a lot more easily to use, it's easier to navigate, I guess you could say, as it relates to there. We have one more slide, I think, and then we'll get on to some more question. I see some comments also about the synchronous piece. We tried really hard, and across 7 grade levels, it wasn't possible to cluster synchronous instruction and provide it small group. So, we had to make a decision of, did we want to cluster synchronous instruction and keep everyone with 20 students in a class, or did we want to have, again, a little more of a complicated schedule to navigate? I want to acknowledge that point, and provide smaller group instruction. And we ended up going with the smaller group instruction. And we think, again, because of the service providers, their special educators, ELL teachers, all those folks who work in multiple grade levels, we couldn't cluster everything and provide small group. And so for us, based on the feedback last year, synchronous instruction was an absolute, and small groups in synchronous instruction was a small group. And that really forced some decisions that our folks had to make when they were designing a schedule. And so I think we've talked about a number of these before. I think, Tim, you mentioned instrumental music. We mentioned some of the online learning platforms, and maybe I can turn it over to you to talk about a couple of those. I think it is worth noting that for the Comandantes program, that schedule actually literally as we speak is being finalized by the teachers in that program. And it will be slightly adjusted because of needing 2 languages. It will likely have slightly less independent time because of the need for oral language skill development in 2 languages. And so, Tim, I don't know if you're able to describe a little bit of the online learning platforms, or just even give a piece of that.
Sure. So this summer, we took a look at some online learning resources that are supplemental in nature. So they do not replace the direct instruction or the main curriculum, but they provide resources for students so that they can access independently that would complement what they're learning. And so one example is Lexia, which is a reading platform. And this is something that teachers will be able to set students up with. The district will provide accounts for students where they log in the very same way that they log in to their district accounts. And it's a game-like platform to practice reading skills, where teachers get information about what students are doing and where they're meeting challenges as they work through it. And there's a similar version in math. It's called Dreambox. And so these will be potential activities to use during independent times that also should not require much in the way of support for children at home. They're very visual in nature, so that students who don't yet read should be able to use them without much problems. And then there are other resources that older students will be engaged in that complement the curriculum. Teachers last spring used a lot of one called Newsella, and this provides nonfiction reading, current events, passages in science and social studies areas at different reading levels, and they're particularly useful at upper grades 3 through 6. And so teachers and students will have access to that. And then in terms of 6th grade, just to mention one, we found that our 6th grade math curriculum, which is also used at the middle school level, has an online version, and this should make instruction and teaching and learning in math a little bit more fluid and smoother than it may have been in the spring in the remote setting.
Thank you, Tim. So I'm just going to scroll up because we got a number of questions. So thank you for all the questions that have been coming in. So we are, I think next week you'll see about the logins. We are trying to kind of reduce the number of logins that students need to do. Again, there probably will have to be a different one for a whole group lesson versus a small group lesson because, there'll be 2 groups going on simultaneously. But we're trying to reduce the number of logins that folks need. I'll be honest that many other districts in other states that mandated more synchronous instruction last year worked on this, and students have got quite adept at being able to log in and out of different lessons, different Google Meets. And for us, it's going to be a little bit complicated because we didn't do as much of that last spring. Our statewide, we didn't do as much, but much of the first week or two is going to be also training caregivers, whoever that is in the home, but also training students to become more independent. So I wouldn't expect that this schedule will be implemented on the first day of school next week with all the different kind of lessons. It's really going to be around community building and building students' capacity to be independent, navigating an online world. So I should have said that at the beginning. And I apologize, I didn't. This question about feedback, we will be gathering feedback throughout the year about how this is going. And this really came from the feedback from last spring about what was working well and not working well. And I think, again, I think one of the challenges that we had is across 7 grade levels of an elementary school, how to balance that. And I think even in the comments that we're seeing, that there's some people who feel like this is too much synchronous instruction and some people who are feeling like this is not enough synchronous instruction. And I think that's the world we live in. When we tried to cut it down the middle, there definitely are districts that are trying to do 4 or 5 hours on Google Meets. For us and all the training we've done from virtual schools, they don't try to do 4 or 5 hours, 5 hours of virtual time in Google Meets every day. We're also trying to balance that we need to do a lot more than we did last spring. And I see those comments about breakout rooms. Really, that's what the small group pieces are, is that they're sort of an opportunity for a breakout room to happen. And I know at the middle school, high school, we're moving towards that a lot as well. So yeah, there's a lot of conversation going on with staff about populating a calendar with appropriate links and creating digital calendar. I see some examples of that. And that's some of the training that teachers had last week was specifically on wayfinding. How do we support caregivers and students around that process? And again, help for students to be much more independent. Let me see, just scrolling back up because I don't want to. Google Meet, actually, none of the programs allow for breakout rooms. So Zoom, which we don't use for a whole host of reasons, breakout rooms don't work on Chromebooks. If you go to Zoom's website, you'll see that. Google Meet does have that program coming out that will work on Chromebooks starting next month. There are, I think it's Google Chrome has extensions that allow for that. So some of our students are providing that. They can do that now, but it will be much more integrated about a month from now. So this question about in-person school, I'll be candid that we're moving forward and progressing with negotiations with the bargaining unit. And when there's an update to give, we'll be happy to give it immediately. We're not at that place just yet. Good question about attendance. Attendance will be taking in that morning meeting. And that's the same way it is during in-person school at the elementary level. And this is not wildly different from the schedule that was emailed out a couple weeks ago in an update. We refined it. We got a lot of feedback from staff members that happened. There's a question, Tim, that you might be able to answer about social studies science, a live session or on the computer or a combination.
So the intention is that social studies and science instruction would be live. And I think probably the way I described it was a little confusing when I was talking about it in the schedule, because I mentioned the possibility that teachers may engage in live instruction and then give students something to do and then pull them back to finalize that. My intent was not to say it would not be live. It will be live instruction. But I think during any live instruction group, there may be a time where teachers say to students to complete some piece of the activity as they're thinking, they would still be live on the screen and then re-engage with the group.
Yeah. So a couple questions. Attendance, according to our state, is required, like it would be for in-person school. So I want to clarify that one. There was an email about for grades 2 to 6 families. We did not ask for binding decisions on in-person versus virtual because it's quite a ways away and we know people may change their minds. As a result, we may have to flex the classroom placements when we move to in-person because folks, invariably will change their minds. Some people will feel more comfortable being in person and some people will be more comfortable or, decide to go the other way. And so that's sort of where we are with that. I think if you have concerns about that, please share them with me. We'll certainly, we present this at a public meeting at school committee. We got some feedback from families, and we continue to move forward. There's a question about specials being each of the specials 1 time a week. That's actually something that in the virtual environment could make sense, but as we move to in-person schooling, we're thinking much more of a residency model, and that's really so that specialists don't see 20 classes a week. From a public health perspective, we don't want our staff members in that. That's not advisable from the health perspective. So it will look a little bit different as we transition to in-person school, but the idea is that students would still have access to a special a day, and they would still have access to all 5 specials and receive the instruction in all 5 areas over the course of the year. Our all classes about 20 students right now. I think all classes are either at or under 20 students. There may be 1 or 2 that I'm missing that are slightly over. But yes, the classes actually will be smaller this year, especially as we move to in-person schooling, because when we mix those 2 in-person classes have to be smaller. But for the virtual classes, I think you'll see a very similar class size, if not smaller than what people are used to. See, sorry, I'm scrolling up and down. There's a lot of good comments. At this point, we're still in negotiations, so there's a lot of questions about in-person, and again, there's more to share, but there's no feeling of everything being pushed back in terms of what the school committee voted. It's just really that first phase wouldn't start till October 1st, and we have more of an update. We will be able to share it. So yeah, great question about first grader and engagement. And I think one of the things that we realized is last spring, we weren't able to provide the level of training for our staff as what we would have liked. And I think everyone did incredibly strong efforts to try to make this work. But what we've learned, really from some of the training we did over summer, but particularly in the last couple of weeks, are different ways to build relationships in an online setting. So I do think people will see not just that there's more synchronous instruction, but actually the pedagogy will look different than what it did last spring. Last spring, I think our staff are doing the best they could to try to integrate in-person learning into a virtual environment without the training. And now that people have had much more training, I think families and students will see much more engaging content because we're supporting our teachers much better than we could have last year. And there's a question, most of the first part of September is trying to feel our way through the processes. I think to Karis Brown's question, absolutely. That we're not starting with, okay, open up everyday math books as if nothing happened on the first day of school. It's really trying to work through where students are as they go. So I think the win block, there's a couple questions about that, Tim, that you might be able to respond to, that if teachers aren't engaged with the teacher during that time, are they given some choices about what to do during that time?
Yeah, and the short answer is yes. So this would be a time that if students are not engaged with another educator in some way, which in some cases is maybe para educators as well, there will be a choice board of activities, a list of assignments, things like that teachers will provide for students to engage in during that block. So it will not just be free time. There will be some activities.
Yeah, and some of them, again, may choose to be off-screen, and for some families, the on-screen options that Tim talked about earlier may be really good options during that time that are more self-directed. For reading services, special ed or Title I services that students receive, that will continue, that students will still receive if students have an IEP or 504 plan that have services, or if they receive services from a reading specialist based on their Title I supports or services. Get the screen off, actually. Those will continue often during the WIN block or other blocks of time, and the special educators or Title I teachers will reach out for those folks. And the WIN block, again, for upper grade students who take an instrument, one of the things the instrumental teachers, it's great for their scheduling, which they're never able to do, is they can teach some students from Fort River and some students from Wildwood simultaneously if they're at the same level playing violin. And so actually, this is one of the weird silver linings is from a scheduling perspective, we'll be able to kind of link similar and especially for students who play low incidence for lack of a better phrase, low incidence instruments, like cello or some of the other instruments, they'll actually have a group to be able to practice with that sometimes they don't in the school setting. So when an independent choice are the same depending on the student, I think that's accurate. Does having a Chromebook offer advantages compared to any other computer? No, there's not a particular advantage. I think using Google Chrome as a browser is an advantage with Google Classroom, but any device that can have that would work. For our youngest students, we're getting iPads, which will work well in terms of a touchscreen for preschool and kindergarten. But if you have a machine at home that you're comfortable with, there's no advantage to using a Chromebook versus one of those. In terms of paper material distributed to students, that'll be like at Fort River. I know tomorrow they're having pickup day, and that'll be organized in advance by either the school or the district. And assuming kids can do off-screen assumes they have a caregiver to help support that. I don't think this is a fair assumption, right? So I want to be really clear that we are not able to provide what we would think of as typical coverage or childcare in a virtual environment. That we know that this is an imposition on families that we have because of the pandemic. So I do want to address that. I don't think there's a way that we could maintain and really provide childcare in the same way in an online setting that we can, in a virtual setting that we can in person. So people can disagree with that statement, and that's fine. But from our perspective, our focus is on education. And, we're trying to do the best that we can with the resources we can to educate kids at the highest level. And we're trying to do that as well as we can, knowing that some families both parents won't be in the home. It will be an older sibling who's an 8th grade student. And that's really the first couple of weeks of building that classroom community and also supporting students to be much more independent about navigating this. We're always amazed at what our students do, like reading. And Tim and I both used to be elementary teachers, and Tim was a primary grade teacher, so he can speak to this better than I can. And our teachers teach our students learn how to read, which is magical. I taught 5th and 6th grade, and I was fortunate that most of my students were in pretty good shape with that when they got to me. And so as opposed to looking at that, we're really going to have to teach our students how to navigate an online world. And much like teaching reading or something like that, there's a code to it. And that's really the focus of the first few weeks, is to help our students be much more independent in doing that. We understand that it's not possible for all families to be home with their students, or they may have multiple students navigating that. One of the great ideas that we got at one of the in-person town halls that we did about a month ago was to have headphones. So we do have some headphones available, and some of the pickups for Chromebooks, we're going to have those available, particularly for income eligible families, because they have multiple children on devices in multiple classes simultaneously in a small house, small apartment. We want to make sure that folks can be able to manage that and be able to not have the calculus class in one room intersecting with the 4th grade class in the same room, because that's where both students are working. So, I think that is our focus, and that's what we're trying to do the best we can. I think for the question about standardized testing, I've got an update on this from the commissioner. Our current Secretary of Education in Washington, D.C. has indicated that there are no waivers coming in terms of statewide standardized testing this spring. We'll see if that person's still in that role when we get to this spring or not. And that's not a political statement. It's just there's an election and we don't know what'll happen. I'll leave it there. So the state doesn't have the ability to suspend standardized testing. Would need a waiver from the federal government. And so it's sort of wait and see on that. For us, we are doing some assessment at the beginning of the school year, and we will do some in the virtual context, because we know that it's been a long time since students were in school in person, and we want to get a better read on where they're at. So this is not high stakes testing. It's really helping us instructionally understand where we are and how we can support our students. Yeah, there's a good one about inter-student interactions outside of academics. So we're trying to provide as much as we can during the school day. Google Meet for Education has some really thick boundaries, and actually school, from a safety and security perspective, we don't typically allow students to be in unsupervised spaces in school. And the same thing sort of operates more or less in virtual spaces for elementary students. So we don't necessarily have a way to facilitate that. But I do think our PGOs do a fabulous job of running events. And I know they'll be thinking about how to do this in a virtual context and how to provide kind of emails and other ways through FaceTime or other resources that families can connect off the school day. But we would have the same supervision concerns about students being together, in school in a virtual context that we do in a in-school context as well. If people still have Chromebooks, maybe Deb, if you could put in Jerry Champagne's email address, he would love to know that. I think at this point, it will need to eventually be returned and get refreshed, and that happened. It was a busy summer, and emails sometimes don't always go to the right place and might have gone to junk about the reminders around that. That's not a problem at all, but as about 2,000 devices are being given out starting yesterday and going through to Tuesday, it may take a little while for us to collect that and refresh it. But if Deb can put Jerry Champagne, who's director of IS's email address in there, that'd be the place to go. I think WIDA would operate similar to MCAS. That is a required test from the state. But that's a really good question, and I don't know if Tim's confident about a response to that one as opposed to MCAS. That's a good one.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I have not heard updated rules around the WIDA yet.
Yeah, so we'll get back to you on that one. Excusable absence kind of functions the same way according to the state as if it was in school. Illness, family illness, things like that. The state has set up attendance guidelines that mirror in-person school or virtual school. Thanks, Deb, for putting Jerry's email address in there. We're looking at first grades getting Chromebooks. And so I think at first grade, we're feeling like if they were in school, they'd be using the desktop computers during computer class. So again, having a Chromebook and getting some support on its use, we feel like is appropriate. And I think it's a good question. And certainly some first graders, if they have iPads at home and feel more comfortable on them, iPads get to be limiting as students learn typing skills and are able to communicate that way. For many students, for myself included, typing on an iPad is more challenging than typing in a keyboard, but I see lots of people better than me at that routinely. So I think if that's a family choice, but there are Chromebooks will be available for first grade. Oh, great. Thank you, Phoebe, for that Chromebook piece about at this point, we'll hold on to them. And I think if there's a fix-up time, it'll come after, the 2,000 have gone out. And if there's a problem, we can get in touch with us and we'll work that out. I know I missed some because they were coming in really quickly. So I'm going to scroll up. We're getting near the end of our time period. I think there's a question at the bottom. So it's a Phoebe, it's a Danielle asked a good question it's a Pelham specific question. So it looks to us, based on the initial read, that we'll have 2 to 3 virtual classrooms across our 2 districts, across Union 26, which is Amherst and Pelham, at the grade level. As Pelham only has 1 teacher per grade level, Pelham's teachers can't do the virtual school plus the in-person school. It's not possible to do both. So for upper grade students, when students come in person and students transition to virtual, there will be 1 teacher that is assigned, or more than 1, but a teacher will be assigned to that virtual classroom as the majority of teachers go to in-person instruction. And so it's, I think there will be that transition, and we can definitely communicate that. For Pelham, it's a unique perspective because there's not another teacher, but the same is true. There may not be a virtual teacher from Crocker Farm for a certain grade level, maybe a teacher from Fort River or from Wildwood. And so we're doing the best we can. I'll be honest that there's many, thanks, Laura. There's many schools that are just using, and I shouldn't say just, but are using online companies to do their virtual. In other words, they're putting all their teachers in the in-person learning and using like Ingenuity or the Florida Virtual Charter School. We've decided in this district, we're trying to support both. We're trying to support both the in-person students with teachers from our districts, as well as the remote. And so there comes with challenges with that. But some of the neighboring districts have sort of avoided that problem. But for us, we wanted our teachers in front of our students, whether in person or virtual. I think the Pelham specific update came from the principal. I think she's emailed that, but I would go to Lee, who's incredibly responsive on that. If you don't need a Chromebook provided, I think you're all set because there was an email just asking for who needed it. Will the kindergartners be doing more screens and video calls? they'll have access to some of those online programs, but especially as those kindergarten students have never been in our schools before, if they have, it was the Crocker Farm preschool. We're trying to keep the screen time lower, and that's why they have half days, to be more realistic about it. But it wouldn't be that they don't have access to the online programs. I'm looking at Tim to make sure I'm correct, that they would have the same access to some of the early childhood and early reading online programs.
Yep.
Yeah. So Danielle's question, it would be a mixed group, Pelham and Amherst kids. It might be a mixed group between Crocker Farm and Fort River kids for that online option. To explain the Chromebooks, anyone who needs a Chromebook can get a Chromebook. There was multiple emails that went out asking for who was interested in Chromebooks, and those pickups are organized by school, and your principal has emailed those out. And if that's something that you haven't gotten, I would get in touch with your principal, but that's sort of in effect. But no one needs to get a Chromebook, because we don't. If you have a device at home that you feel like you'd like to use, or you feel is sufficient, that's great, particularly as there's a nationwide Chromebook shortage based on some things going on the other side of the world. But I think if you're in a grades, my advice would be if you have a student in grades 1 through 6, having some kind of laptop or Chromebook is probably advisable. For some people, the iPad may be sufficient, at least at the beginning of the year, and people may want to transition later. If it's a Fort River, I see a Fort River specific question. If people can't pick up supplies, I would get in touch with Ms. Chamberlain to see what other options are available. The iPads are en route. They've been saying they've been shipped for a while, and as soon as we get them, we're going to provide them. But like many technology devices these days, the back orders on them is a real challenge. So we're scrambling as best we can to provide the resources as best we can. So there's a question: if phase 2 students stay online, how might they get a teacher from another school? How does it work with principals and directives related to each school? So at the time that students go in person at any phase, they may get a teacher from another school, because it's going to be a district-wide approach to who the virtual teachers are. Again, our choices were a district-wide approach, or a virtual school, like Florida Virtual School is the one that most people around here are using, or Ingenuity. So that transition will happen when we ask for binding surveys, which will be a couple weeks before that phase starts, and it'll be communicated who that teacher is ahead of time. And so there's a question about in-person versus independent work versus special education services. And that's really dependent on what the special education service is. So that's going to be individual student dependent. So for kindergarten, we would be giving an iPad, not a Chromebook anyway. That's correct. And I think for kindergartners to start with, at this point, it's really just a device that they can access and meet their teacher. I think it's much less important what device it is. This is the beginning of kindergarten. Really, it's around building relationships. It'll be about orienting. So I think for 5-year-olds, I wouldn't stress which device it is at the moment, because we're not going to be asking tremendous amounts of homework or work to be done. It's really going to be much more teacher-directed and orientation focused at the beginning of the year than it is going to be sort of getting to the curriculum in a very fast way. We know that these children are 5 years old. We know they're entering kindergarten in a very unusual circumstance. And we know, particularly for the students who are coming in person, assuming that we wrap up negotiations effectively, they're going to be starting in-person school pretty soon. So that online interface is really going to be about supporting students about how does kindergarten work, and supporting their re-entry into school a couple weeks later. So that's not one I would stress. One of the nice things about Google Meets right now is if people have Google Chromecast, I think it's called, people can also stream from any device onto their television, which is a really nice feature for thinking about young kids and screen sizes. And so that's what I'd say about kindergarten. And teachers can conduct classes from the classroom virtually. They also can do it from their home setting, and that's a choice that teachers are making. I think probably the last question we have time for is, most students want to participate in the same specials on the same day. So the special schedule will rotate by different grade levels. So it would be that it's not so much a choice perspective, it's that the group would go together to those specials. Yeah. And so it's 9:20. We're about 5 minutes over, but that's okay because there's a lot of good questions. If there are continuing questions, I'd encourage you to follow up with either your child's teacher, which you'll find out in the next day. I think almost all the placement information at all the schools is going out today or tomorrow, so that'll come soon. Or certainly can reach out to the principal for some school-specific questions. I know our teachers are well equipped to be able to manage this. They're really focused on orienting all of your children as well as all of you into what this school year looks like. I know it's a really odd thing, and we really appreciate your patience that we're in trying to reinvent what we do in school. And I feel much, much more confident in where we are than I did last spring, because we've had a summer of incredible work done by our teachers. And Tim was one of the people who organized this around, we organized multiple sessions of live instruction for our special education students, for Title I students, for ELL students. And we learned a tremendous amount about what works and what doesn't in a non-emergency setting in the summer. So we're really taking what we know didn't work in the spring as well as what did, what worked much better in the summer, and really trying to apply it. And we know it's complex, but what I guarantee you is your teachers will walk you through this, and they're not going to, no student's going to be lost on day one with getting, I'm on page 74 already of the book that I'm supposed to be reading. It's really going to be a soft entry into, this is what this year is going to look like. This is what this is how this is going to work. This is how we're going to support you as children, as caregivers, to make the best out of this experience. And so I want to reassure people that we've showed a schedule that's not going to exist on day one. The schedule on day one is much more focused on that orientation. That's going to last for a couple of days because we want people to feel comfortable and confident. Everything that's in this slide deck will be on our website, on the fall 2020 website later this morning. The actual schedules that Tim went through was emailed out a couple of days ago, I think, Tim. I'm trying to think.
Tuesday maybe.
Yeah. And in terms of the A and B blocks, your classroom teacher or the school will be sharing that before the school year starts, so you have that. Mm-hmm. And so we know imperfect situation, imperfect solution. We feel much better about this solution than where we were last spring, and much better about offering live direct teaching every single day in all of the primary content areas and small groups to your children. So with that, appreciate all the feedback and comments. Keep them coming to either myself, Tim, or the principals. Maybe Deb can put mine and Tim's email addresses in here, the principal's email addresses I think you'll have. For those of you who couldn't come to this YouTube link will stay live and active. So if someone wants to watch this, the same YouTube link that you're all accessing right now, you can email to people and say, oh, this was good. You can send it. We'll also send it in the newsletter that's coming tomorrow. And in terms of day one, you will hear from your teachers in your school about the logins before then. That'll be individual. So, Tim and I don't have the master list to send you at the moment. And we did, from a security perspective, we wouldn't put it in a public space anyway, because we're very conscious of that. So again, we really appreciate the 150 or so people who logged in today to have this. Hopefully more people get to see it. And we really appreciate all the questions and feedback, and we'll continue to do these kind of sessions moving forward. Have a great morning, and look forward. I'm sure everyone's anxious to get their placement information the next day. So I know you'll be at your mailboxes looking out for that. And thanks again.